podcast Green Edge, Best in BESS. Episode 4, UC84, Poland's new grid connection rules. Hello and welcome to episode 4 of Green Edge, Best in BESS, the English edition. Before we dive in, a quick note on why this episode is important right now. If you've been following this series, you might expect that after covering the fundamentals, the container components and CNI applications, the natural next step would be an episode on project development in Poland, how you actually take a BESS project from an idea to ready-to-build status. And that episode is coming. But a few days ago, the President of Poland signed into law one of the most significant pieces of energy legislation in years, the bill known in the industry as UC84. The comprehensive amendment to the energy law fundamentally changes how grid connections work in Poland, and it affects projects that are already in development, not just the new ones. Given how important these changes are, it made sense to address them immediately rather than wait. Almost a year of legislative works, 2 rounds of consultations, Senate amendments, industry protests, and finally it's done. The law is in force. This is one of those moments where you need to stop and understand exactly what changed, what it means for your projects, and where are the risks that you absolutely need to know before you make your next move in the Polish market. If you're an international investor with projects already in development in Poland, or if you're considering entering the market, this episode is essential to listen, because UC84 doesn't just apply to new projects. It reaches back and touches projects that are already in the pipeline. And that retroactivity is something every foreign investor needs to understand in detail. So, let's get into it. To understand UC84, you need to understand the problem this law is attempting to solve, because this legislation didn't appear from nowhere. It's a direct response to something very concrete that has been building for years. Over the past several years, Poland accumulated an enormous portfolio of renewable energy and BESS projects with issued grid connection conditions that never actually entered the construction phase. I wrote about this phenomenon on LinkedIn in an article about zombie projects. If you haven't read it, I recommend you do. The industry estimates that we're talking about tens of gigawatts of reserved grid connection capacity locked up by projects that exist only as a set of administrative decisions. Grid connection conditions in someone's pocket, a land lease agreement signed, maybe some preliminary design works, and that's where it ends. The project sits in a portfolio labeled active development, gets shown to investors as an asset available for purchase, but in reality, it will never be built. The consequences? Investors who actually want to build cannot get grid connection conditions because the capacity is already taken. The substation is full, the operator says there's no room. And there's no room because someone reserved the capacity 3 years ago and nothing has happened since. This mechanism had been genuinely slowing down the pace of renewable energy development in Poland, and it was one of the main demands from the industry. Clean up the rules, clear out the zombie projects, free up capacity for investments that will actually be realized. UC84 is an attempt to address this demand, but, and this is important, the response contains both sensible elements and elements that raise serious concerns. We'll go through all of them. It's also worth explaining why there was pressure to pass this law quickly. UC84 is tied to milestones in the KPO, the National Recovery Plan. Poland must meet certain conditions for energy sector reform to unlock the next tranches of EU funding. This explains why the law moved relatively quickly through Parliament despite numerous objections from the industry. From the perspective of an international investor considering Poland, this context matters. The law was shaped not only by what makes sense for the market, but also by political pressure to meet EU deadlines. That tension shows up in some of the provisions. Now, let's go through the specific changes following the project lifecycle, from grid connection conditions all the way to the mechanism affecting the entire market. Grid connection conditions used to be valid for 2 years from the date of delivery. That was true until UC84 entered into force. Now, the validity period is 1 year. This sounds like a detail, but in practice, it's a fundamental change for the development process. Why? Because developing a BESS project from obtaining grid connection conditions to signing the connection agreement is not a matter of weeks. You need to verify the cable route, negotiate easements with landowners, go through the zoning process or analyze the local spatial plan, prepare the building permit application and so on, and only then sign the connection agreement. For a project that requires fixing documentation issues or has a complicated cable route, 1 year may simply not be enough. What does this mean in practice? First, developers must act faster and more decisively. Obtaining grid connection conditions need to be preceded by solid preparation, not just filling an application to reserve a spot for the future. Second, for investors buying projects at the early development stage, check the date when grid connection conditions were issued. A year goes by quickly, especially if the project requires regulatory fixes. There are exceptions to this rule. Offshore and nuclear projects have 10 years, railway has 2 years. For standard renewable and BESS projects, 1 year. So, one clarification, the shortened validity applies to conditions issued after UC84 entered into force. Conditions issued earlier retain their previous validity period. Although, as we'll discuss when we get to retroactivity, this doesn't mean all previous rules remain unchanged. One positive change in this area, UC84 introduces an obligation for operators to publish information about available grid connection capacity. Operators serving at least 100,000 customers will have to create an online platform allowing investors to check available capacity, track application status, and access information about issued conditions. Today, this information is practically unavailable. An investor submits an application without knowing what's in the queue ahead of them, how long they will wait, or whether there is any chance of connection at a given substation. This is supposed to change. Operators have 24 months to implement these platforms, so we won't see results before 2028. The second area of changes concern fees. And here I need to be precise, because UC84 introduces 3 separate financial instruments, not one, and each hits at a different point in the process. The first instrument is a new fee for simply submitting an application for grid connection conditions, a mechanism that didn't exist before. Right now it's 1 PLN per kilowatt of requested connection capacity, with a maximum cap of 100,000 PLN. It's not refundable and must be paid separately for each connection point. Otherwise, the application is left without consideration. For a 50 megawatt project, that's 50,000 PLN, just for submitting the application. The second instrument is a doubled advance payment toward the connection fee, from 30 PLN to 60 PLN per kilowatt, with a maximum cap of 6 million PLN. For a 10 megawatt project, the advance is now 600,000 PLN instead of 300,000. For a 50 megawatt project, 3 million instead of 1.5. The third instrument is an entirely new security deposit for fulfillment of obligations under the connection agreement. For installations up to 100 mega, 30 PLN per kilowatt. For installations above 100 mega, 60 PLN per kilowatt, with a maximum cap of 12 million PLN. The security can take the form of a deposit in an interest-bearing account, an insurance guarantee, a bank guarantee, or a surety from a parent company with appropriate credit rating. Let's add this up for a concrete example. So a 50 megawatt project, application fee 50,000 PLN, advance payment 3 million, security 1.5 million PLN. That's over 4.5 million. You need to put up before you have financing, before you have a building permit, before you know for certain that the project will happen. This is a fundamental change to the cost structure for entering a project. For large corporate groups, this is an additional cost. Unpleasant, but manageable. For smaller independent developers who have traditionally served as project incubators bringing projects to RTB status, this can be a real barrier. Several million PLN frozen in fees and securities across multiple projects simultaneously is a serious position in the budget of a company that doesn't have large capital backing it up. And this brings us to the consolidation effect that concerns the industry. The Polish Photovoltaics and Energy Storage Association warned during the legislative process that UC84 could lead to a situation where the market for developing renewable and BESS projects concentrates in the hands of few large players, both state-owned energy groups and large foreign capital. Smaller companies that until now develop projects and sold them at the ready-to-build stage may simply not have the financial capacity to handle the new requirements. As was pointed out during consultations, Photovoltaics is already a mature market, but energy storage is just developing in Poland. There's a risk that will slow down this segment at the very beginning of its growth, raising barriers to entry exactly when the market should be gaining momentum. The third element of UC84 is milestones in connection agreements, and this is a change I evaluate positively. How does the mechanism work? Every grid connection agreement will now contain milestones, defined stages of investment that the investor must complete within specified timeframes. The key milestone is obtaining a final building permit for at least 80% of the requested capacity within 24 months of signing the connection agreement. For energy storage, also 80% of the capacity covered by the agreement. Failure to meet the milestone results in an automatic expiration of the agreement by operation of law. The goal is clear and justified, eliminating projects that reserve grid connection capacity without any real plan to build. 24 months for a building permit is sufficient under normal development. Typically, including corrections and documentation supplements, you obtain a building permit in 3 to 6 months. Complications happen: appeals, coordination with other stakeholders. But if a project has such problems, it usually means it had them from the very beginning. The milestone just reveals this earlier, instead of allowing the project to sit in a portfolio for years. My concern is different. Not about the timeline itself, but about what happens on the operator's side. The schedule for processing applications, timelines of issuing approvals, response time for technical documentation. These are elements outside the investor's control that can generate delays in the chain. That's why my recommendation is simple. Don't wait until the last moment, run processes in parallel where possible, and actively monitor every stage. It's worth noting that the Senate recognized this problem and introduced an amendment defining a closed catalog of circumstances that exempt from automatic expiration of the agreement. This includes natural disasters, acts of war, terrorist acts, and also, very important, delays in issuing decisions and permits by public administration bodies, provided the investor proves due diligence in timely filling applications and supplements. In such cases, you can apply for an extension of up to 24 months, but this requires posting additional security of 60 PLN per kilowatt, maximum 12 million PLN. This is an important safeguard that protects genuinely ongoing projects from the consequences of administrative sluggishness. One thing is certain, this change ends the model of buy grid connection conditions, wait for better market conditions, and sell to a large player. That model worked as long as conditions were valid for 2 years and nobody really looked at the implementation progress. Now, it won't work. The fourth element of UC84 is new types of connection agreements. And this is one of the more complex topics in the entire law that requires careful explanation. Until now, a connection agreement works essentially on an all-or-nothing model. Either the operator has technical conditions for full connection or they refuse. UC84 introduces two new formulas. The first is a flexible agreement. Under this arrangement, an investor can start operating an installation before the grid has been upgraded to target capacity, but with limitations on energy injection or withdrawal during a transitional period. These limitations automatically expire no later than 3 years after the installation is commissioned. This is a logical solution for situations where the operator is planning grid upgrades, but the upgrade timeline is longer than the investment timeline. You can start operating earlier, accepting temporary limitations, instead of waiting several years until the grid is upgraded to target capacity. But there's also a second formula, a configurable agreement, and this is where serious questions arise. Configurable agreements allow for limitations that vary over time, depending on current grid operating parameters. And, note this, these limitations can apply indefinitely. Let me translate this into practical language. You sign a connection agreement for 50 mega, but during certain hours when the grid is congested, the operator can reduce your capacity to 20 mega, and can do this for the entire operating period, not just for 3 years. Your financial model assumes a certain level of revenue based on full capacity. If for a significant part of the year you're limited to 40% of that capacity, revenues are proportionally lower, and in a way you cannot precisely predict in advance. From the perspective of financing a BESS project, a configurable agreement without a time limit effectively means you cannot finance the full installed capacity. A bank will not take the risk of an investment that it cannot regularly utilize. It's a bit like opening a restaurant for 100 guests, where the grid operator can let in only 30 at any given moment, with no guarantee of when and for how long. No lender will accept such revenue projections as a basis for financing. And here we come to what I consider the biggest hidden risk of this mechanism. UC84 gives operators a tool to issue configurable conditions, and this means operators gain significantly more control over what actually flows into the grid and when. Systematically, from the perspective of grid stability, this is not without logic, but renewable energy in Poland is overwhelmingly private investors who engage private capital based on a specific revenue model. If an operator can indefinitely limit the capacity of connected installations, the investor effectively doesn't know what they're investing in. This is shooting yourself in the foot as far as private capital is concerned, capital that's supposed to finance the energy transition. That's why if you receive a proposal for configurable agreement, read every provision about frequency and depth of possible limitations carefully and calculate your financial model under a pessimistic scenario for their use, not an optimistic one. Of course, we can say that right now the operator has the same possibility to limit our power. It's called curtailment, sure. But in this case scenario, BESS was a solution for curtailment. But if you receive a configurable agreement for BESS project, now it changes the rules of the game. But now the best news from the entire UC84 package, at least from the perspective of energy storage projects, cable pooling is being extended to BESS. Let me remind you what cable pooling is. It's a mechanism that allows multiple installations to share a single grid connection. Until now, under Polish law, cable pooling was available only for renewable installations. A wind farm and a solar farm could share a connection because the production profiles complement each other and together they rarely exceed connection capacity compared to each one separately. BESS was excluded from this mechanism. UC84 changes this. The amended Article 7 of the Energy Law explicitly states that two or more installations or energy storage facilities belonging to one or more independent legal entities can be connected to the power grid at voltages above 1 kV at a single connection point. Importantly, not just renewables, but energy storage and potentially any installations. The law also changes nomenclature in key articles from renewable energy source to energy storage facilities and system users, which formally legitimizes the hybridization of Polish energy. What does this mean in practice for hybrid projects? Well, imagine an existing 20 mega solar farm with a 20 mega connection. The capture rate of that farm is dropping. Curtailment is rising. I wrote about the scale of this problem on LinkedIn in an article about PV and BESS hybrids. Until now, adding energy storage to that farm required a new, separate connection for the BESS. New connection conditions, sometimes new cable route, new costs. Now storage can come in under the existing connection if the combined profile of both installations fits within available connection capacity. During hours when PV isn't producing, BESS can charge or discharge using the same connection. During hours when PV is producing at maximum, BESS absorbs the excess instead of losing it to curtailment or selling at a low price. This is a change that can significantly improve the economics of retrofits, adding BESS to already operating solar farms. Until now, the barrier was often precisely the cost and time of obtaining a new connection. Now, that barrier is substantially lower. It's worth noting, however, that the wording of the provision is only half the journey. In 2024, the first year of cable pooling for renewables, according to URE, only 130 applications were submitted for just under 1.6 giga of capacity, which given market potential is a modest result. This was directly due to interpretation barriers and inconsistent approaches by individual distribution system operators. The new provisions address these barriers, but practice will show how quickly operators adapt their internal procedures and technical standards. From my experience, detailed internal instructions from individual DSOs appear with several months delay after legislative changes, so for some time after UC84 enters into force, you can expect some interpretive uncertainty at the level of specific substations. But nevertheless, this is a very positive change. But there are also a few smaller, but I would say also important changes that shouldn't escape our attention. There will be something called no connection zones. UC84 gives operators the ability to designate areas in network development plans that are close to new connections. Applications submitted for such areas will be left without consideration. From the perspective of grid management, this is logical. The operator can indicate where there physically isn't room anymore and doesn't have to waste time processing more applications that would result in refusal anyway. From the investor's perspective, before you submit an application, check whether the location isn't in a closed zone. Otherwise, that non-refundable application fee goes down the drain. Next thing is Power Guardian. The operator will be able to suspend energy injection to the grid in case of improper operation of the Power Guardian or exceeding connection capacity. For hybrid projects where multiple installations share a connection, the power management system must synchronize data from individual sources in milliseconds and dynamically regulate its installation operation, guaranteeing that the connection capacity defined in the agreement is never exceeded. This element must be considered in EMS architecture at the design stage. I would say another positive change, because now the investors will have to plan their projects carefully and include proper infrastructure at the very beginning. Another part is elimination of the 48 months limit for completing renewable connections. Previously, regulations required completion within 48 months. Now this requirement is eliminated. Milestones enforce a sensible pace of implementation anyway. So this is flexibility without practical consequences for projects that are actually moving forward. Another good thing, possibility of having multiple delivery points under a single connection. A customer can apply for an additional delivery point without obtaining new connection conditions. Good news for hybrid projects where a solar farm and BESS have different owners or different financing structures and need independent metering. Another part, generation or storage activity before obtaining a license will be possible for 12 months from the first energy injection to the grid, a procedural simplification for projects that want to enter the commercial phase as quickly as possible. Again, now you receive a buffer of 12 months in order to provide all the administrative decisions and obtain proper license. And finally, the element that provoked the loudest opposition from the industry, and in my view, rightly so, retroactivity. UC84 applies the new higher financial requirements. The application fee, double advance payment, new securities, milestones. Not only to new projects, but also to projects with already issued grid connection conditions or signed connection agreements. The transitional provision of the law provides short deadlines for compliance with the new requirements. Failure to meet these deadlines can lead to expiration of agreements or loss of validity of connection conditions. During parliamentary works, the Senate worked out a compromise on the level of retroactive securities, and this is important information for those who have projects in progress. If on the day the law enters into force you have a signed and effective connection agreement, the new security for fulfillment of obligations is 50% of the standard rate. If you only have issued connection conditions but haven't yet signed an agreement, the security is 25% of the standard rate. This is a significant softening compared to the original bill, which assumed full retroactive application of new provisions. Is this sufficient softening? Well, it depends on the project. For large installations, even 25% of the new security means several hundred thousands to several million PLN. That simply wasn't in the original project budget. The industry appealed for months for complete exclusion of retroactivity. The logic was simple: new rules for new projects, old rules for old ones. PIME and PSF-EME pointed out that investors made decisions to enter projects based on a specific regulatory framework. Changing that framework mid-game violates the fundamental principle of legal certainty. The ministry's argument was that without retroactivity, owners of zombie projects would have no motivation to act. And I understand this argument regarding projects that have been sitting for years without any progress. However, the same retroactivity hits projects in the middle of real active development, and that's changing the rules at the wrong moment. From a broader perspective, and this is where I want every international investor to pay close attention, regulatory retroactivity is one of the main factors raising perceived investment risk in a given country. Foreign institutional investors, infrastructure funds, financing banks, they all evaluate regulatory stability as one of the key parameters when deciding whether to enter a given market. The signal that existing agreements can be effectively renegotiated by the legislature with retroactive effect is not a signal that attracts long-term capital. And Poland needs tens of billions of PLN in private investment to achieve its energy transition goals. The cost of regulatory unpredictability is real, even if it's hard to measure directly. For you as a foreign investor, this creates a specific challenge. You may have built a business case 6 or 12 months ago based on certain assumptions about costs and timelines. UC84 changes some of those assumptions retroactively. The fees you didn't budget for are now due. The timeline you thought you had is now shorter. And the question you need to answer is, does the project still work under the new rules? Well, UC84 is a law whose evaluation depends on your perspective. From the perspective of the power system, the direction is correct. It was high time to clean up the market of zombie projects and free up capacity for investments that will actually be realized. From the perspective of investors and developers, some changes are positive, some generate new risk and very real financial pressure. And retroactivity leaves a bad taste and questions about the predictability of the Polish regulatory environment. What should you do now if you have projects in your portfolio? Well, 3 things. First, check the dates when grid connection conditions were issued and the status of agreements for each project. And verify what the transitional provisions of UC84 means for you, because compliance deadlines are short. Second, revise your financial models for the new fees, securities, and potential limitations. Third, if you have existing solar farms and have been considering adding BESS, the entry of cable pooling for storage is exactly the moment when the conversation should start in earnest. If you need support reviewing your project portfolio in light of UC84, analyzing the economics of PV retrofit with BESS, or conducting complete due diligence before purchasing a project, that's what GreenEdge Solution does. If you have a project in execution and need support with owner's engineering, progress verification, and contractor coordination, that's the scope of Rova Systems. Contact information for both companies is in the episode description. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode. Cześć!